She drove the first pickaxe blow into the hillside on a September morning, and the whole valley laughed. A widow, a boy of 8, a pickaxe, a trowel, and a dead man's tools. Everyone in Harlan's flat knew what Lena Mercer was doing up on that south ridge, digging herself a hole in the ground like an animal, as the feed store man put it, and everyone agreed it would kill her before January. They were wrong about the killing. They were wrong about almost everything. What Lena was building into that hillside was something none of them had ever seen. Stone floors that remembered warmth, a drainage system that turned water into an ally, a ceiling of sandstone and packed earth that held 58 degrees through the worst night of a brutal Colorado winter, while their wood frame cabins cracked and failed around them. She was building with knowledge they didn't know she had, knowledge passed hand to hand through years of watching, questioning, listening to a mason who loved her explain how stone thinks. And then February came, and the snowpack gave way, and Red Hollow Creek stopped being a trout stream. In the dark, with the valley floor underwater, and 18 terrified neighbors climbing her slope by lamplight, every month of ridicule and cold and doubt came down to one moment. A stone arch standing in a hillside, a door held open, a lantern burning in the entrance. She had built it for her son. The water comes without warning. One moment the valley below Red Hollow Creek is sleeping, wood smoke rising from cabin chimneys, a dog barking somewhere near the mill road, the ordinary sounds of an October midnight carrying thin and clear through cold air. The next moment there is a sound like the earth clearing its throat, low and grinding, and then the creek is no longer a creek. It is a wall. Dark water, 20 feet high, churning with fence rails and roof shingles and the splintered bones of other people's homes, tears through the valley floor as though the land itself has decided it is finished tolerating what was built upon it. On the hillside above, a lamp burns in a window cut into the earth. Inside, a woman and her boy sit dry and warm and completely, impossibly safe. 3 days before winter arrives in the valley, in the last good week of autumn, 1884, 8-year-old Lena Mercer asks his mother a question while she is mortaring a stone course above the doorframe of a home that does not yet look like one. "Mama," he says, "why do people laugh at things they don't understand?" Lena Mercer sets down her trowel. She is wearing her late husband's work gloves, cracked at the knuckles, smelling of linseed oil. Her dark hair is caught under a kerchief. There is dried mortar on her forearm, and a bruise along her left thumb from a dropped stone 3 days prior. She thinks about the question for a long time. Because, she finally says, understanding something takes effort, and laughing is free. Eli considers this. Is that why Mr. Dobbins called it a burial hole? That's why. Are we going to prove him wrong? Lena picks up her trowel. She taps a stone level, checks it with her eye the way Thomas taught her. We already are, she says. The valley that cups the town of Harlan's Flat was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they have not yet had occasion to remind you of what they can do. Red Hollow Creek came down from the San Juan foothills in a long, lazy S-curve, and for 9 months of the year, it was nothing more threatening than a good trout stream, maybe 12 feet wide, running cold and clear between banks of willow and alder. The town itself, 40-some structures if you counted the livery annex and the 2 outbuildings at the grain merchants, sat in the lowest part of that valley, arranged around a single main road that the residents called a street, but which was really just a wider version of the creek's intentions. Lena Mercer had arrived in Harlan's Flat 3 years prior, in the autumn of 1881, riding a freight wagon beside her husband Thomas, with their 5-year-old son between them, and everything they owned in a canvas-covered box in the back. Thomas was a mason, a proper trained one, apprenticed in Pennsylvania and journeyman certified before his 22nd birthday. He had come to Colorado because there was work. New towns needed stone foundations, stone chimneys, stone retaining walls to keep the mountains from remembering the towns were there. He had letters of introduction and a reputation that preceded him, and for 2 good years he built things in Harlan's Flat and the settlements around it that were solid and true, and would likely outlast everyone who ever looked at them. Then in February of 1883, Thomas Mercer went to help raise a collapsed mine entrance on the Baxter claim east of town, and a secondary collapse took him. He was 31 years old. The mine owner sent Lena a letter of condolence and $11. What she had after that? Eli, who was 6, a one-room rented cabin on the valley floor on the east side of town, with a leaking roof and a fireplace that backdrafted in any north wind. $240 in savings. Thomas had been careful, always careful, and a cast-iron stove. A Bible, her husband's tools, chisels, a pointing trowel, a margin trowel, a good spirit level, 2 wooden mallets, a chalk line, a plumb bob on a braided cord he had made himself, and 3 years of watching Thomas work, asking him questions, listening to him think out loud about load paths and drainage and the way cold moves through stone. She was a seamstress. She took in laundry, she mended harnesses and re-wove chair seats, and did whatever work came her direction. And she stretched those $240 with the determination of someone who understood that they were not just money, they were time. Time was what she needed. By the summer of 1884, she had formed a plan, and by September, she had found the place to execute it. The site was on the south-facing slope of the long ridge that ran behind Harlan's Flat, maybe 400 feet above the valley floor. It was a spot Thomas had once pointed out on a Sunday walk, a natural bench in the hillside, where a shelf of sandstone bedrock broke the surface, backed by a vertical face of the same stone rising 8 feet. The slope below it ran south-southeast, which Thomas had explained was the gold standard for a passive solar site. Winter sun low in the sky would strike a south face for most of the day, while summer sun, high overhead, would barely touch it. The bedrock backing would absorb heat like a slow-breathing creature and release it through the night. That shelf, Thomas had said, that's a gift. Someone built on that, they'd never be cold. Someone was about to. The plan Lena had arrived at was not the plan of a reckless woman. She had spent 6 months reading everything she could find, in the lending library at the church, in Thomas's own dog-eared copy of a Pennsylvania masonry manual, in 2 issues of the Scientific Agriculture Journal she had traded a hemmed tablecloth to obtain. She understood the concept of a berm structure, built into a hillside, earth insulating 3 sides, open only to the south. She understood thermal mass, though she did not use that phrase. She thought of it as stone remembering warmth. She understood that proper drainage was not optional. It was the whole conversation. Thomas had told her that a dozen times. Water is patient, Lena. Water will find every mistake you made and introduce you to it. She had 11 weeks before hard winter, by her estimate. She had her husband's tools, her $240 reduced to $112 after 3 years of careful use, and Eli. Eli, who was 8 years old and wiry and deeply serious in the way that boys become when they have spent 2 years watching their mother hold everything together. He could carry 20 pounds up a slope without complaint. He could hold a chalk line taut for as long as it needed holding. He had his father's eyes, gray-green, steady, measuring, and his father's habit of studying something for a long time before he touched it. The cabin on the valley floor she let go in September. The landlord, a man named Dobbins who operated the feed store and owned roughly a third of the rental properties in Harlan's Flat, was not sorry to see her leave. She had always paid, but she had always paid exactly and on time, which had never given him the leverage he preferred. He stood in the road and watched her load the wagon with the stove and the tools and the folded canvas and the food stores. "Where are you going?" he asked. She pointed to the ridge. He looked at the ridge. He looked at her. He laughed once, short and flat, the way a man laughs when he is deciding not to be confused. "You're going to dig yourself a hole," he said, "like an animal." Lena Mercer tied the last knot in the canvas cover, checked Eli's position on the wagon seat, and picked up the reins. "No," she said, "like a mason." The sight revealed itself to be better than she had remembered, and harder than she had expected, both at once. The sandstone shelf was real and solid. She tested it with Thomas's heaviest chisel, and it rang cleanly. No hollow resonance, no fracture lines. The vertical backing face was 8 feet of the same stone, competent and dry. What she had not fully accounted for was the volume of earth between the surface of the bench and the level she needed to reach to give herself ceiling height. The shelter would need to be dug back into the hillside roughly 14 feet before she hit the bedrock rear wall she intended to use as her back structure. 14 feet of earth and loose shale with a capstone ceiling she would build from the sandstone she excavated, and that earth would need to go somewhere. It would not simply wash back in. She stood on the shelf the first morning with Eli beside her and looked at the scope of it. She had a pickaxe, 2 shovels, one long-handled, one short, a pry bar, the masonry tools, and a wheelbarrow with a repaired wheel she was not entirely confident in. She had hemp rope and 2 canvas tarps and 50 pounds of dry mixed mortar she had purchased from the supply wagon that came through Harlan's flat twice monthly. She had 11 weeks. She drove the first pickaxe blow into the hillside on the morning of September 15th, 1884, and the hill gave back a chunk of shale the size of her fist and a shower of red dust. Eli watched the dust settle. "How long will that take?" he asked, meaning the 14 feet. "About a week," she said, though she was not certain. "And then?" "Then the interesting part." He picked up the short-handled shovel. "I'm ready," he said. She believed him. She drove the pickaxe in again. The town found out within 48 hours, because towns always do. It was Martha Pell who first climbed the slope to look. Martha ran the post office and considered information a professional obligation. And it was Martha who came back down and told Grace Aldridge at the dry goods counter. And Grace told her husband, and her husband told the 3 men at the barber. And by the end of the second day, everyone in Harlan's flat knew that the widow Mercer had gone up to the South Ridge with her boy and a pickaxe and was digging herself a hole in the ground. The reactions sorted themselves into predictable categories. Amusement was the most common. Dobbins had used the phrase burial hole on the day she left, and it caught, the way the mean phrases always do. Simple, visual, just cruel enough to feel clever without being cruel enough to feel wrong. Men used it at the feed store. Women used it in quieter voices at the laundry. Children used it without understanding it, which was the purest form of the thing. Concern, genuine and otherwise, was the second category. Pastor Elias Fogg came up the slope on the 3rd day with his hat in his hands and his most pastoral expression arranged on his face. He was a decent man in most respects, and he genuinely believed he was helping. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I wonder if you've considered the church has a property on Birch Lane, vacant since the Howells departed in July." "I have a plan, Pastor Fogg," Lena said, without stopping her work. She was in the excavation by then, the hole already 4 feet deep and wide. Swinging the pickaxe in the particular diagonal rhythm she had discovered was most efficient for breaking the shale layer without jarring her wrists. "I appreciate the concern. The winters here are— I know what the winters are." He stood at the edge of the hole for a moment. Eli was below, shoveling the broken material into the wheelbarrow. The operation had an evident logic and efficiency that the pastor could see, even from above. "The stone ceiling," he said, despite himself. "That's capstone construction?" Lena stopped. She looked up. "You know masonry?" "My father was a builder, in Ohio." He hesitated. "The grade of the floor, you're pitching it toward the opening and then down the slope via a cut channel, Water follows the grate out before it ever reaches the back wall. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that was not quite certainty, but was the beginning of it. "I'll pray for dry weather," he said. "I'll take it," said Lena, and went back to swinging. The third category, the one that mattered more than the others, because it had the potential to actually stop her, was practical opposition. This came primarily from her own head, in the long hours between dark and sleep, when Eli was bundled in the canvas tent they had rigged between two pines above the excavation site, and she lay listening to the wind and running the arithmetic. 50 pounds of mortar was not enough. She had known this, somewhere beneath the confidence she needed to maintain in order to begin. The capstone ceiling would require 3 to 4 times that volume if she was going to do it correctly. Thin-set joints, full bearing on each stone, no gaps that cold air could find and exploit. The sandstone she was excavating varied in quality. Some of it was excellent, dense and flat-splitting, and some of it was soft and crumbly and useless. She needed to be selective, which meant she needed more volume of excavation than she had first calculated, which meant more time. The door frame was another problem. She had planned to use timber, but the timber available in Harlan's flat was expensive. The nearest sawmill was 30 miles northwest, and she had mentally allocated that cost without accounting for the quantity of stone she would need to fill the opening properly around a wooden frame. A stone arch would be stronger and cheaper if she could cut the voussoirs, the wedge-shaped arch stones, accurately enough. Thomas had cut arches. She had watched him cut arches. She had never cut them herself. On the 5th night, by lantern light, she sat outside the tent with Thomas's masonry manual open on her knees and worked through the geometry of a semicircular arch, the way he had shown her, with a stick and a cleared patch of dirt as her drawing surface. The keystone, the spring line, the rise and the span. She calculated the angle of each voussoir cut, 11 stones, each with faces angled at roughly 16 degrees from vertical, tapering to a point at the top of the arch. She could do this. She believed she could do this. But the doubt was real. The doubt was a cold thing that sat behind her sternum and did not leave, not entirely through any of those early nights. She was a seamstress who had watched a mason. The valley below was full of families who had proper cabins with wooden walls and iron stoves and neighbors within shouting distance. She had 11 weeks and a wheelbarrow with a suspect wheel and a boy who was 8 years old. She thought about Thomas, not with grief. She had moved through the worst of that grief in the first year and had emerged from it with a kind of quietness, but with the specific memory of his hands on stone, the patience of him, the way he would set a stone and look at it, and take it back up and set it again until the fit was exactly right, without frustration, without hurry, because the stone would be there long after his hurry was forgotten. She closed the manual. She smoothed the dirt over her calculations. She would do it the way Thomas did it. She would do it until it was right. On the 7th morning, she woke before light and lay still for a moment, listening to Eli's even breathing, and felt the doubt do something she had not expected. It did not disappear, but it moved. It settled down from her chest into her feet, where it became something more like ballast than burden. She had been, until this moment, reacting to the necessity of leaving the cabin, to the pressure of time, to the worry about what she didn't know. She had been building defensively, always half an eye on the town below, half an ear tuned to what the Dobbinses of the valley thought of her. She sat up. She began to braid her hair. She was going to stop building against the winter. She was going to start building for Eli. The difference mattered. It changed the order of operations in her mind. Instead of beginning each morning with a calculation of what she was afraid of losing, she began it with a picture of what she was creating. A home with south light across a stone floor. A ceiling that held the day's warmth into the dark hours. A door that a flood could not reach because it was 40 feet above any flood line this valley had ever seen or would see. A place where her son could wake up and be safe. She came out of the tent. The valley below was still dark, the town just beginning to show its first lamps. Up here, the sky had a faint cold light to the east that would become the sun in another hour. She picked up the pickaxe. She was building a home. His name was Callum Briggs, and he was 12 years old, and he appeared on the slope on the 8th morning, carrying a tin pail with 2 cold biscuits and a wax paper packet of salt pork, which his mother had sent, with the accompanying message that she hoped Mrs. Mercer was well and not dead yet. Callum himself had not delivered the message with quite those words. He had said instead, "Mama sent food. She says you're very brave, or very foolish, and she can't tell which, but either way, you probably need biscuits." Eli received this assessment with great seriousness. Callum Briggs's mother, Ruth, was a practical woman who had grown up in Tennessee in a household where her father had dug a root cellar so good they had used it as an emergency shelter twice during bad seasons. She had seen, when she let herself look at it clearly, the logic of what Lena was doing. She had not yet worked up the courage to say so in public. But she sent biscuits and salt pork, and eventually herself, on the 12th day. Ruth Briggs stood at the edge of the excavation and watched Lena work for a long, quiet time. "Tell me what you need," she said. Lena looked up. Mortar dust on her face, Thomas's gloves on her hands. "Company," she said, "and another 50 pounds of mortar." The excavation took 9 days instead of 7, because the shale gave way on day 6 to a band of harder mudstone 2 feet thick that required twice the effort per inch. Lena learned to read the material, to look for the hairline planes of weakness in the rock face, to aim the pickaxe at those planes rather than at the center of the face, to let the geology do part of the work instead of fighting it square on. This was, she realized, something Thomas had told her in different words. Find where the stone wants to go and help it go there. By day 9, she had a space 14 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 6 feet 6 inches high at the rear wall, the natural sandstone face, which she had cleaned and inspected and found solid throughout. No significant voids, no fault planes that would open under the weight of what she planned above. The floor pitched toward the opening at a fall of 3/4 of an inch per foot, which she confirmed with Thomas's spirit level, checking it 3 times, because a drainage grade was not a thing she was willing to approximate. The excavated material, roughly 40 cubic yards of shale, mudstone, and mixed earth, she had moved in stages down the slope, and used to build a berm on the east and west sides of the entrance, which would both reduce wind exposure and eventually be planted with the same native bunch grasses that covered the rest of the hillside. Nothing wasted. Thomas had been like that. Eli had moved roughly 1/3 of that material himself. On the evening of the 9th day, they sat at the opening of the excavated space and ate boiled beans from the camp pot. And Eli looked into the 14 feet of carved-out hillside with his father's measuring gaze. "It smells like the earth," he said. "It is the earth," said Lena. "That's the point. It's bigger than I thought it would be. It needs to be. We're going to divide it. Sleeping area at the back near the thermal mass, main living space in the front half. Stove here." She pointed to a spot 8 feet in, on the east wall, so the heat circulates before it reaches the door. Eli looked at where she was pointing. "Papa would like this," he said. Lena set down her bowl. She looked at her son. "Yes," she said, "he really would." The stonework began on the 10th day, and this was the part that Lena had both dreaded and anticipated, the part where she stopped moving earth and started building the thing that would hold them. The first priority was the drainage channel. Before she laid a single stone in the wall, before she cut a single voussoir for the arch, she cut the channel. A groove 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, running down the center of the floor, from the back wall to the entrance, and then continuing another 8 feet down the hillside outside, carrying any water that found its way in during heavy rain or snowmelt away from the structure entirely. She used the margin trowel and Thomas's narrowest chisel for this work, scoring the line first with the chalk line, then chipping along it with patient, careful blows. It took most of the 10th day, and by the end, her forearms ached from wrist to elbow. "Why does the channel need to be that deep?" Eli asked, on his knees watching her work. "Because water under pressure will find the shallowest path," she said. "If I give it a deep, clear path, it takes that path and stays in it. If I give it a shallow one, it wanders." Lena laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. Exactly like people. Ruth Briggs came on the 12th day as she had said she would, and brought with her an additional 50 pounds of mortar in a gunny sack balanced across her horse's withers. She also brought, without announcement, her husband's broad-bladed hoe, a coil of jute rope, and a jar of rendered beef tallow, which she explained was excellent for waterproofing mortar joints. "My father used it," Ruth said. "He swore by it." Lena took the tallow with both hands. The wall stones came from the excavation spoil, the dense, flat-splitting sandstone she had set aside, and from a loose stone talus field 200 yards east along the ridge, where generations of freeze-thaw cycles had already done the work of separating the best pieces. She and Ruth and the two boys spent 2 full days hauling stone to the site, stacking it by size near the entrance, large flat pieces for the floor and lower wall courses, medium irregular pieces for the upper courses, small wedge-shaped fragments for chinking the gaps. She built the floor first, a dry-laid stone floor, no mortar, pieces fitted as tightly as she could manage, with a slight doming toward the drainage channel at the center. The fit of each piece she tested by stepping on it and rocking her weight. Any piece that moved came back up and was reset. When it was done, 2 full days of stooping work, she stood at the entrance and looked at it, and it looked like a real floor, level and solid and dry, warm-toned sandstone that would hold heat all day and give it back through the night. "Oh," said Ruth when she saw it. "The stone has a memory," Lena said, which was how Thomas had explained it, and which was still the truest way she knew to say it. The walls she built, in courses, mortar set, using the thin-set joint technique she had watched Thomas use, not packing the mortar thick and relying on volume to compensate for poor fit, but fitting each stone close and using a thin, consistent mortar bed for bonding and weather sealing only. The tallow went into the outer face of every joint, worked in with a pointing trowel, making the surface slightly water repellent. She built the east and west side walls first, up to the spring line of the arch, 4 feet 6 inches above the floor, and let them cure for 3 full days before she touched them again. The arch she had been thinking about for weeks. She had cut her test voussoirs from a piece of soft sandstone with Thomas's narrowest chisel, working by the geometry she had calculated in the dirt, checking each angle with a bevel gauge she had fashioned from 2 sticks and a bolt. She cut 11 voussoirs and laid them dry on the flat ground outside the entrance, before she mortared a single one, dry set the whole arch, including the keystone, to confirm the fit. The first dry assembly was imperfect. The 3rd stone from the left was too thick and forced the whole ring out of curve. She took it back and recut it, removing 1/8 of an inch from one face, and when she reassembled the arch dry the second time, it was right. She could feel it was right, the stones settling into each other with a slight mutual tension that is the signature of a true arch, each one holding the others. Eli watched her set the keystone. "What happens if you take that one out?" he asked. "The arch comes apart." He thought about this. "So the last stone is the most important?" "The last stone is only possible because of all the others," she said. "They're all the most important." She tapped the keystone home with the wooden mallet. Ruth, standing behind them, let out a long breath she had apparently been holding. "Lord," she said quietly, "that's something." The arch stood on its own. The void it framed, 4 feet wide, 6 feet high at the crown, was the entrance to what was becoming, undeniably, a home. Lena ran her fingers along the curve of the arch. She could feel the load distributed evenly through the stones, exactly as Thomas had described it, not fighting gravity, but redirecting it, sending it harmlessly down and out. She smiled, and her eyes were bright. The stove required the most creative problem-solving. She had the cast-iron stove. It had come west from Pennsylvania in the wagon, and it was the best thing she owned after the tools. But the stovepipe installation in a stone structure was a different calculation than in a wood-frame cabin. The flue needed to exit through the ceiling, which meant she needed to create a penetration in the capstone ceiling she had not yet fully built. And that penetration needed to be sealed against rain and heat loss while allowing the pipe sufficient clearance to prevent the surrounding stone from cracking under thermal expansion. Thomas had mentioned this problem once in reference to a chimney project he had done for a family outside Durango. He had used a collar of fire clay packed around the pipe at the ceiling penetration, fire clay being heat-resistant and slightly flexible, accommodating the expansion without fracturing. She had no fire clay. She had, however, Ruth Briggs, who had grown up in Tennessee and had a memory like a well-organized pantry. Ruth thought for a moment and then said that her father had substituted a mixture of common clay and fine wood ash, roughly 3 parts clay to 1 part ash, for fire clay on 2 occasions, and it had held. How long did it hold? Lena asked. Long enough, said Ruth, which is what you need right now. They found the clay in a cut bank along the seasonal drainage 200 yards north of the site, a seam of dense gray-blue clay exposed by water erosion, consistent and plastic in the hands, exactly the quality she needed. Eli discovered it on a solo scouting expedition he undertook on a Friday morning while Lena and Ruth were working the upper wall courses, and he came back down the slope at a run with both hands gray to the elbow and an expression of profound self-satisfaction. They dug out a half bushel of clay with the short-handled shovel and mixed it in the camp bucket with a measured volume of fine hardwood ash from the cook fire. She burned only hardwood, precisely because she might need the ash, working it with her hands until the mixture was homogeneous and stiff. She packed it around the stovepipe collar during the ceiling installation, pressing firmly with her thumb to ensure no voids, then covered it with a second application the following day, when the first had dried to leather hard. When she finally fired the stove for the first time, a small, careful fire of dry pine kindling, she stood with one hand near the collar for a full 10 minutes, monitoring for heat leakage. There was none. The stovepipe installation led naturally into the ceiling construction, which was the final major structural element, and the one she had thought about most. The capstone ceiling, large flat slabs of the best sandstone, spanning between the side walls, needed each stone to carry the weight of earth above it without cracking. Thomas had told her that the safe span for a sandstone slab was roughly 6 times its thickness. A 4-inch thick slab could span 24 inches before the risk of fracture under load became serious. She had measured her best ceiling stones and sorted them by thickness, and she laid them with this rule in her mind, using the thicker pieces for the wider spans, and supporting the long axis of each slab on at least 2 inches of bearing on each wall. The earth she replaced above the ceiling in layers, 4 inches of loose earth first, tamped gently, then 6 inches of the finer material, then the original surface material, finished by hand to match the surrounding slope as closely as she could manage. What she was creating above the ceiling was insulation, 12 to 14 inches of earth that would change temperature far more slowly than air, absorbing summer heat and releasing it in winter, keeping the interior within a narrow, habitable range, regardless of what the sky was doing. She had read about this in the Agriculture Journal. She had thought about it for 6 months. Standing now on top of the completed ceiling, looking down at the entrance arch below and the valley far beneath, she felt something that was not pride exactly. Pride was too loud for what this was. It was closer to recognition. as though the hillside had been waiting for exactly this arrangement of stone and drainage and thermal logic, and she had simply helped it become what it already wanted to be. The stove went in on the 22nd day. Ruth's Callum and Eli carried it between them in 2 stages up the slope, from the wagon, which Lena had brought as close as the terrain allowed, to a flat staging area, and then the final difficult pitch to the entrance, while Lena guided the placement from inside. The stove sat on a base of 3 courses of dry-laid stone, raising it 4 inches above the floor and protecting the stone below from direct heat. She had fashioned a simple grate from iron rod purchased at the blacksmith for 6 cents. When it was in place, when the pipe was connected and the collar sealed and the damper tested, Ruth Briggs looked at the interior of what was now undeniably a shelter. Stone floor, stone walls, arched entrance, stove. The proportions of the space were not generous. Roughly 12 feet by 10 in the main room, with a sleeping alcove of 8 by 8 cut into the back. But they were real, and they were right. "It's warm," Ruth said, and she sounded surprised, and then she sounded something else. "It's actually warm." Word of what was happening on the South Ridge traveled through Harlan's flat in the way of all small-town intelligence, slowly at first, then suddenly. For the first 2 weeks the story was the burial hole woman and her madness, treated as a winter's worth of amusement. Then people started walking up the slope to look, and the story changed its shape. It was the floor that got people first. Men who built things, the carpenter Silas Vance, the blacksmith Orrin Hadley, came up and stood at the entrance and looked at the dry-laid sandstone floor and the careful drainage channel, and made the involuntary sounds that craftspeople make when they see good work. Vance crouched down and pressed his palm flat on the stone. "That doesn't move," he said. "No," said Lena. "How did you fit them so close?" She showed him the technique of test-stepping each stone, the selection process, the chisel work to reduce high spots. He watched her fit a floor stone that had been rocking slightly. She had left it deliberately, intending to address it. Saw her mark the high point with chalk, chip it down with 3 careful blows, reset the stone. It did not rock. Vance straightened up. "Your husband taught you this," he said. "He taught me to think about it," she said. "The doing took practice." Hadley, the blacksmith, was more interested in the stove installation and the fire clay collar. He had a professional's appreciation for problems involving heat management and material choice. He examined the collar carefully, tapping it with 1 finger, asking about the ash ratio. 3-to-1, clay to ash? By volume, yes. I'd have guessed higher ash content to improve the thermal tolerance. So would I, initially. The higher ash content reduced the plasticity too much. It crumbled before it cured. He nodded slowly. This was the language he spoke. "You've got a good draw," he said, meaning the flue. He held his hand near the stovepipe and felt the movement of air. "That pitch on the pipe is exactly right." Meanwhile, the living of the life continued because it had to. Lena had laid in stores before leaving the cabin. 100-pound sack of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried beans, 10 pounds of rice, a tin of salt, a tin of baking powder, 4 pounds of lard, a dozen links of dried sausage from the German butcher on Main Street, and a 10-gallon crock of apple butter Ruth had given her. She had a canvas bag of dried apples and another of dried corn, shelled. She had coffee beans and a hand grinder. She cooked on the cast-iron stove, and it was extraordinary what the stove did in that space. In a wood-frame cabin, a stove heated a room. The heat rose immediately to the ceiling and found every gap and draft and left through them. Here the heat struck the back wall, 8 feet of natural sandstone, and the side walls and the floor, and it stayed. The stone accepted it and held it. By the second week of regular fires, the interior of the shelter was maintaining a temperature of roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit through the night, even on nights when the outside temperature dropped to 20. Lena documented this with a small mercury thermometer she had purchased at the general store, the last of a particular personal budget she had set aside for instrumentation. She noted the readings in the back of Thomas's masonry manual, which had become her site log. Interior temperature morning and evening. Outside temperature. Stove wood consumed. Weather observations. For protein, there was the sausage and beans, which carried them through the first month. After that, she had an arrangement with Ruth. Ruth's family kept chickens, and Lena did mending and alterations in exchange for eggs and, when available, stewing hens. She set 2 rabbit snares on the north side of the ridge. Thomas had taught her this, a simple figure 4 trigger set in a run, and over the course of the winter took 14 rabbits, which she skinned, jointed, and stewed with dried corn and salt in the camp pot that sat permanently on the back of the stove. Eli ate better than he had in the cabin. He was also learning to read stone the way his father had. Lena gave him small tasks, chinking a gap in the east wall with a wedge fragment she had already selected, so that the choice was hers and the placement was his, and watched him approach each one with that steady, measuring gaze. He was learning by doing, which was how Thomas had learned and how his teachers before him had learned, back through the generations of people who had built things to last. There was a period of perhaps 10 days in late October, when the weather turned warm again, the mountain autumn's last generosity before winter settled in for good. And Lena used those days to complete the exterior work, the berm planting, such as it was possible with the season so late, the capstone of the entrance arch, which she had been waiting to set permanently until the arch had demonstrated its structural stability, and the simple wooden door, which Silas Vance built and brought up the slope on a Thursday morning and hung without being asked, fitting the hinges himself, planing the edge until it swung true. He stood back and looked at the door in the arch. "That," he said, "is a house." Lena ran her hand along the edge of the door, the smooth planework. "Yes," she agreed, "it is." The interior took shape in stages, the way all homes do, not in a single transformation, but in the accumulation of small decisions. Lena built a sleeping platform in the rear alcove from salvaged timber and flat stones, raising it 14 inches off the floor, high enough to escape ground cold entirely, low enough for Eli to climb easily. She laid their 2 wool blankets and the canvas sleeping tarp over a stuffed tick mattress she had sewn before leaving the cabin, filled with dried bunch grass from the hillside above. It was the warmest sleeping arrangement either of them had experienced in 3 years. She built a shelf along the east wall from salvaged timber Vance had left over from the door, 3 boards fixed between iron brackets Hadley had bent to fit the stone wall. On this shelf she placed the coffee grinder and tin, the 2 plates and cups, the Bible, Thomas's masonry manual, and a mason jar holding 3 sprigs of dried lavender that Eli had found growing wild on the south slope and brought in with the solemnity of a boy presenting flowers. The lavender was the thing that made her cry. Not in front of Eli. She waited until he was asleep, but she held the jar and she cried, quietly, because it was the kind of thing that said home in a way that stone and drainage grade and thermal mass could not. The light in the space was better than she had anticipated. The south-facing entrance, 4 feet wide and 6 feet to the crown of the arch, admitted winter sunlight that traveled all the way to the back wall from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, striking the sandstone and warming it. She had left a gap in the east wall stone course at shoulder height, covered with oiled paper she had asked Ruth to bring, that served as a secondary window, admitting additional east morning light without compromising the insulation. By November 1st, 6 weeks after she had driven the first pickaxe blow into the hillside, the shelter was complete. Lena stood at the entrance on that first November morning and looked inward at the stone floor, the shelf with the lavender jar, the stove with its clean pipe, the sleeping alcove where Eli was still asleep, a shape under wool blankets with one arm thrown out. She looked outward at the valley, at the town waking below. She had built it. It was done. It was real. The first hard snow came on November 12th. It came overnight, Lena woke to the silence that only snow creates, that particular emptiness of sound that means the world outside has been covered and softened. And she rose and opened the door and stood looking at it. 6 inches on the bench outside the entrance, the berms on either side smoothed to gentle curves, the slope below running white and clean to the valley where the cabin rooftops showed as dark rectangles under their snow blankets. Inside, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. She checked the thermometer. She stood in the door with the cup warming her hands and watched the valley. And something shifted in her. Not the private, defensive satisfaction she had been carrying since September, the quiet pleasure of being right against the doubt, but something more open, something that looked outward rather than inward. The snow was not hardship. The snow was the proof. And proof, she realized, was not private property. Proof was a thing that could be shared, and in being shared, could change what other people understood about what was possible. She had not built this to be right. She had built it to keep Eli safe. But now that it was built and standing and warm on the inside of a November blizzard, she understood that the building was not the end of something. It was the beginning. She thought about Ruth Briggs, who had set biscuits and then herself, and then her strength and her knowledge of fire clay and ash ratios. She thought about Ruth's children. She thought about what this winter was going to teach the valley. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was the hardest winter in the San Juan foothills since 1872, according to the men at the general store who kept track of such things by the rings of trees and the memories of the oldest residents. It came down in 3 stages, each colder and deeper than the last, as though the mountains were making a point. The first stage, in November, was the snow Lena had watched from her doorway. Manageable. The valley cabins handled it as they always had. People split more wood, kept their fires burning higher, hung extra blankets over the windows, and stuffed rags under the door sills against the drafts. The second stage came in December. 3 days of freezing rain that glazed every surface in the valley. The road, the cabin rooftops, the tree branches, the fence rails, under a half-inch shell of clear ice, followed immediately by another foot of snow that now sat on a frictionless underlayer. Roofs began to fail. The grain merchant's outbuilding lost its south face entirely when the lurch shifted. The Hadley barn had a partial collapse along the ridgeline. No one was hurt, but 2 families lost significant portions of their winter food stores. Orrin Hadley came to Lena. He did not say he was coming. He simply appeared one December morning on the slope, picking his way carefully up the iced path she had begun to cut each morning from the entrance down to the main trail. He was a large man, not easily embarrassed, and he stood at the entrance to her shelter with his hat in his hands and looked at the ceiling, 14 inches of earth, now under 2 feet of snow, the interior temperature reading 54 degrees despite 4 days without sun, and said, "I lost a third of my winter corn in the barn collapse." "I know," said Lena. "I heard. I've got 2 children and a wife, and the corn I have left is not going to last until March." She looked at him steadily. "I have dried beans, a good supply. Ruth Briggs has a root cellar that's half empty because she stored more than she planned to need. Mrs. Lund at the far end of Maine has a smoked ham and salted pork she'll tray for labor." He blinked. "You know all this?" "I've been paying attention." She had been paying attention since September, because it was the kind of attention Thomas had taught her. Look at the whole system, not just your part of it. Know where the gaps are before the gap finds you. "What do you want for the beans?" "Nothing," she said. "Come in and get warm first. Then we'll talk about what everyone has and what everyone needs and see what the arithmetic works out to." He came in. He sat on the stone bench she had built along the west wall, and he looked at the stove and the shelf and the hanging dried herbs. She had added dried thyme and sage to the lavender by November, found on the south slope, and the thermometer on the wall and the mason jar holding the pencil she used for her temperature logs. "It's worn," he said, as Ruth had said. "It's designed to be warm," she said. Eli made coffee and served it with the serious precision of a boy who has decided that hospitality is a skill worth mastering. Hadley wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the child. "Your mother is extraordinary," he told Eli. "I know," said Eli. The conversation that followed was practical and productive. Lena had, in fact, been doing the Valley's resource arithmetic for weeks, not from any intention to manage people, but because the habit of systems thinking that masonry had taught her applied just as naturally to food and fuel and family capacity as to drainage and thermal mass. She knew who had surplus and who had deficit, who had skills to offer and who had needs to fill, because she had been listening carefully during Ruth's visits and the conversations at the supply run and the odd exchanges at the entrance of her shelter, which had become a regular stopping point for people walking the Ridge Trail. By the time Hadley left that morning, he had a plan to trade 2 days of smithing work to Mrs. Lund for the salted pork, and an arrangement with the Vance family for shared wood splitting in exchange for cornmeal from the Briggs surplus. Nothing that any of these people could not have arranged themselves, but no one had arranged it, because no one had been holding the whole picture at once. Lena had been holding it, because she was a mason's wife and she thought in systems. The third stage of winter came in January, 21 consecutive days below 0 Fahrenheit, a cold so absolute it cracked a tree in the churchyard and split the iron handle of the communal water pump, which then had to be operated with a wrapped cloth for the remainder of the season. Wood consumption in the valley cabins tripled. 3 households ran short. The shelter on the ridge, consuming perhaps a third of the firewood a comparably sized cabin would have required, became not just Lena's home, but a reference point. People began to discuss it with a different quality of attention. Not amusement, not concern, something closer to mathematics. What Lena did not anticipate, because she had been too focused on the cold and the food and the practical arithmetic of survival to track the social weather with the same precision, was that Dobbins was paying attention too. Ferris Dobbins owned 7 rental properties in the valley, all of them currently occupied, all of them earning him a monthly income that depended on those tenants having no alternative to renting from him. He had watched, through the winter, as the widow Mercer's improbable hillside hole became the subject of serious discussion among the town's men, and as that discussion had shifted from mockery to reluctant admiration, he had felt something tighten in his chest that he would have called concern for public safety if anyone had asked him, but which was in fact something considerably less civic-minded. He came to see her in January, during the deepest cold, picking his way up the iced path with elaborate caution and arriving at her entrance in a state of red-faced indignation that he had not quite manufactured, but had certainly cultivated on the walk up. "I've had complaints," he said, standing in the entrance. Lena was at the stove, stirring a pot of bean and rabbit stew that had been going since morning. She did not stop stirring. "From whom?" "Concerned residents. The structural integrity of a thing like this, people are wondering if it's safe, if it sets a precedent." "A precedent for what?" "For people building wherever they like, without permits or survey or any of the usual." "There is no permit requirement for building outside the town boundary," she said. "This site is 400 feet above the town boundary and 200 feet above my own property claim, which I filed at the county registrar in September." She had done this on the same trip she bought the thermometer. It had cost $3 and had felt like $3 extremely well spent. "You're welcome to review the filing." Dobbins absorbed this. His face went through several adjustments. "The safety issue stands," he said. "A stone ceiling is architecturally safer than a wood frame roof under snow load. The Hadley barn demonstrated that in December." A pause. "The fire risk. A stone structure with a properly installed iron stove is considerably less fire-prone than a wood frame cabin. You own 7 of those, Ferris." He stood in her entrance in the January cold and looked into her warm-lit interior. The stove, the shelf with the lavender and the Bible, the temperature log on the wall, Eli doing sums on a slate board at the stone bench, and she watched him run out of objections one by one, like a man reaching the bottom of a bag he had believed was deeper. "People are going to try to build things like this," he said, finally, "all along that ridge." "I hope they do," she said. She said it without heat or triumph, which was the most devastating way to say it, and they both knew it. He left. She went back to the stew, and she stirred it, and she did not allow herself to feel the satisfaction fully, not yet, because she recognized that a man who has run out of arguments has not necessarily run out of intentions. She was right to be cautious. What Dobbins did next was quieter than she expected, and more damaging. He did not challenge her property filing. He had apparently checked and found it airtight. He did not call the structure unsafe in any official capacity, because he could not make that case stand. What he did instead was talk. He talked at the feed store, at the barber, at the county commissioner's monthly meeting, where he was a regular and influential presence. He said the word squatter, which was inaccurate but sticky. He said the word liability, which was vague enough to mean anything. He said that a woman alone on a hillside was one bad winter from becoming a public charge, and that encouraging her delusion was not kindness, it was negligence. This did damage, because this was the kind of argument that found the people who wanted to admire what Lena had done, but had not yet fully decided it was safe to say so. A few of the men who had been warming to her work went quiet. Silas Vance, who had hung her door without being asked, stopped coming up the slope. Orrin Hadley still came. The bean arrangement had become a genuine friendship, and Hadley was not a man who let Dobbins tell him what to think. But he came less frequently and with a sheepishness that told Lena the words were reaching him. Ruth Briggs came on a Thursday in late January and sat on the stone bench with her hands folded and told Lena what was being said, because Ruth was the kind of friend who believed in equipping people with accurate information, even when the information was uncomfortable. "He's telling people you're stubborn and proud," Ruth said, "and that the cold will finish what good sense hasn't." Lena was quiet for a moment. What do people say back? Some people say nothing. Some people agree. Orrin Hadley said that your stew was the best thing he ate in January, which, in its own way, was the best defense offered. Ruth almost smiled. And Mrs. Lund told him to mind his own roof before he worried about yours. "Good for Mrs. Lund," said Lena. "Good for Mrs. Lund," agreed Ruth. But the quiet and the distance were real, and Lena felt them. February arrived with a thaw that was warm enough to be worrying. In the mountains, a midwinter thaw was not relief. It was a loading event. The snowpack that had been building since November, compacted by its own weight, bonded by successive freeze-thaw cycles into a dense, heavy mass, was now receiving meltwater from above while remaining frozen at depth. The creek, running under ice since December, began to show open water at the bends. Small rivulets appeared on the south-facing slopes, running in the drainage channels and seasonal tracks that had been dry since autumn. Lena watched this carefully. She had read about snowmelt hydrology in the Agriculture Journal, not a complete treatment, but enough to understand the basic principle. When meltwater cannot percolate through frozen ground, it runs laterally across the surface, seeking any available channel, and the volume it can accumulate in a matter of hours is far greater than any of the channels in the valley had been designed to handle. She looked at Red Hollow Creek with a different set of eyes than the valley residents had. They saw a trout stream, a landmark, a boundary between the east and west sides of town. She saw a drainage system, a system that had been loaded well above its normal capacity by an exceptional winter, and that was now receiving additional input at a rate the channel could not sustainably accommodate. She said something about this to Ruth on a Thursday visit. Ruth looked at the creek from Lena's entrance. A silver thread from this altitude, bending through the valley. Unremarkable. Thomas used to say, Lena began, and then stopped. What did he say? He used to say that water is patient. It waits for the moment when every mistake made has been introduced to its maker. She paused. I think the creek is being patient right now. Ruth looked at the creek for a long moment. Then she looked at Lena. How patient? I don't know. The thaw may refreeze and slow it, or the next melt may come on top of this one. She watched the silver thread. Should we tell people? This was the question Lena had been sitting with for 3 days. She had no standing. She had spent the last month being talked about as delusional by Dobbins, and the town had been receptive enough to that characterization that a significant fraction of residents now regarded her as eccentric at best. If she stood in the road and said that Red Hollow Creek was going to overflow, based on what? Her private reading of a thaw cycle? The words of her dead husband, repeated secondhand? The most charitable response she could hope for was polite dismissal. The least charitable response was one more story for the feed store. She decided to tell Orrin Hadley, not because she was certain, and not because she thought he would necessarily act on it, but because Hadley was a man who thought in physical terms, in loads and tolerances, and the behavior of materials under stress. And she thought that if she explained it in those terms, he would at least receive it without immediate dismissal. She went to the smithy on a Wednesday morning, in the second week of February, Eli beside her, the path down the slope slippery with freeze-thaw crust that crumbled unpleasantly underfoot. The smithy was warm, beautifully, overwhelmingly warm, the forge already going, and Hadley looked up from a hinge repair he was doing when she came in. She told him what she had observed, the snowpack depth and density after this exceptional winter, the meltwater volume she had estimated based on the surface runoff she could see from the ridge, the frozen ground preventing percolation, the creek already showing open water at the bends under conditions that should still have it fully iced. She told him what Thomas had said about water finding the stakes. Hadley listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When she finished, he set down the hinge. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Move your winter corn stores up from the cellar to the second floor of the barn. Tell the Vances and the Pells to move anything irreplaceable above floor level. And," she paused, "tell them why, so that if I'm wrong, they know it was my reading and not yours." "You're not asking me to protect you from being wrong," he said, and it was an observation, not an accusation. "And to tell some people to move their things. The cost of being wrong is a morning's labor. The cost of being right and not acting is considerably higher." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll move the corn," he said. "Thank you." "And Mrs. Mercer." He picked up the hinge again, turned it in his hands. "For what it's worth, Dobbins says what Dobbins says. Some of us have been paying attention to different evidence." She looked at him, his large, careful hands on the iron. "Thank you for that too," she said. She did not know if her reading of the snowpack was correct. She genuinely did not know. She walked back up the slope with Eli, and she looked at the creek, and she thought, "Thomas, I am trying to think the way you thought. I am trying to see the whole system. I hope I am seeing it clearly." The creek ran, silver and patient, through the valley below. The refreeze she had hoped for came on February 18th. 4 days of hard cold that locked the meltwater back in and stopped the surface runoff, and gave the valley a false reassurance. The creek iced over again at the shallows. People who had been quietly moving things to upper floors moved them back down, because winters in the San Juan foothills ended in March, and March was 2 weeks away, and it seemed like the worst had passed. Lena did not move anything. The temperatures she was recording on her thermometer told a different story than the reassurance. The overnight lows were dropping only to 14-15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to refreeze the surface, but not cold enough to reconsolidate the deep snowpack. which had become structurally compromised by the earlier melt cycle. The snow on the ridge above the valley had the look she had come to associate with instability, a surface crust over a layer that was wet and heavy and not fully cohesive. She wrote in Thomas's masonry manual, "Snowpack compromised, surface frozen but mass unstable. Creek held high water from earlier melt. Second melt event will find compromised channel at high volume. Timing unknown. Watch the temperature." Eli read over her shoulder. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the kind of mother she tried to be. "I'm concerned," she said. "There's a difference. Scared means you stop thinking. Concerned means you think harder." He nodded, taking this in with the seriousness he brought to most things. "What do? We stay ready. We make sure everything we need is here or high. We make sure our neighbors have been warned." She closed the manual. "And we watch the temperature." She sent Eli down to Ruth Briggs with a note on the 20th of February that said simply, "Keep things above floor level. I don't know when, but I believe it is coming." Ruth sent Callum back up the slope with a reply. "Corn is already in the loft. Husband thinks I've lost my mind. Probably worth it. RB." On the 21st, the temperature rose and kept rising. By noon, it was 42 degrees Fahrenheit in the valley, and Lena stood at her entrance and watched the snow on the ridge above begin to sweat, and the thin lines of meltwater on the south faces of every slope in sight multiply from ones to tens to hundreds, all of them running toward the same destination. She watched the creek begin to breathe. It happened the night of February 22nd. Lena heard it before she saw it. That low, grinding sound that she would later learn was described by survivors as the earth clearing its throat. She was already awake. She had not been able to sleep, and she was sitting on the stone bench with the thermometer in her hand and Thomas's manual open in her lap when the sound came, first as a vibration she felt through the stone rather than heard, and then as a growing thunder from the direction of the mountain drainage above town. She was at the door in the same moment. The valley below was dark and still, the town's few lamps burning their ordinary yellow points. And then, over a period of perhaps 15 seconds, which was both an eternity and nothing at all, it was not still. The creek took the valley floor. She could not see the individual structures, not clearly, not in the dark. What she could see was the line of lamps extinguishing as the water found them, moving left to right through the town in a dark wave. And then the sound of it, a sound like continuous thunder mixed with the percussion of heavy objects being struck and broken. And then a terrible quiet broken by voices. She stood in her door and looked at the dark valley and felt the solid stone floor under her feet and the warm air behind her, and thought of her neighbors, and her heart contracted with a fear that was entirely on their behalf rather than her own. Eli was beside her. When had he woken? His hand in her hand. "Are they all right?" he asked. She did not know. She held Eileen's hand and looked at the dark valley and thought about all the things she had done and had not done. She had told Habley. She had sent the note to Ruth. She had told Orrin to tell the Vances and the Pells. She had done what she could from where she stood, which was the position of a woman that most of the town had spent 4 months deciding not to take seriously. And she had known that position when she worked within it and had tried to account for it. But the voices coming up from the valley were frightened voices, and there were many of them, and she did not know who had been above the waterline and who had not. She made herself think clearly, the way Thomas had taught her. Panic is not useful, Lena. Panic spends the energy you need for solving the problem. She lit the good lantern and hung it in the entrance, where its light would be visible from below. A marker, a signal, a small beacon saying here, up here, there is safety up here. Then she built up the stove, not to comfort herself, though it did that, but because whoever was coming up the slope would be cold and wet and frightened. And the first thing cold and wet and frightened people needed was warmth. She set the bean pot on. She had a full pot of dried beans already soaking. It went onto the stove with water and salt, and cut the remaining dried sausage into the pot, and added the last of the dried corn, and set it to a hard simmer. The smell that rose from it was dense and warm, and smelled like shelter. Eli watched her work. "Mama," he said, "what if people—" He stopped. She came to him. She put her hands on his face, the child's face, his father's eyes, and she looked at him steadily. "The water moves fast, but it moves low," she said. "The cabins are on the valley floor, which means everyone inside them moved upward the moment they heard the sound. People run uphill. It's instinct." She was speaking from her reading, from Thomas's principle about water seeking the low path, from the mathematical reality that a flash flood in a narrow valley gives relatively little advance time, but also limited lateral spread. The water will be in the lower few feet of the valley. The people will be above it. She believed this. She needed to believe it. And she also genuinely believed it. "And they'll come up here?" said Eli. She looked at the lantern in the entrance, throwing its warm light out into the night. "They'll see the light," she said. "They know where we are. They've known since September." She pulled him close for a moment, just the solid warmth of him. And then she straightened up, because there were footsteps on the slope. Not one set, many, coming up through the dark, slipping on the freeze-thaw crust, calling to each other, the sounds of people helping each other uphill, the sound of families. Lena stood at the entrance of the home she had built with a pickaxe and a trowel, and her dead husband's knowledge, and her own 2 hands, and she held the door open. Ruth Briggs was the first through the door, pulling Callum by the hand with her youngest on her hip, wet to the knees, her eyes wide but not panicked. Ruth was not a panicking kind of woman. She stopped inside the entrance and looked at Lena, and the look that passed between them in that moment carried everything. The biscuits in September, the fire clay and ash ratios, the 50 pounds of mortar, the Thursday visits, the notes sent back and forth through children, the months of quiet faith in each other's judgment. "I told Martin I was bringing the children here the moment I heard the water," Ruth said. "He said you'd be asleep. I said your lamp would be burning." "It was," said Lena. "It was," agreed Ruth. Behind her on the slope, more people were coming. Lena could hear them. Orrin Hadley's voice, low and organizing, counting heads in the dark. Silas Vance, with his wife and 2 daughters. Old Mrs. Lund, being helped up the steeper section by the Pell boy. Pastor Fogg, who had asked about capstone construction on a September afternoon, and had apparently remembered where the capstone was. And coming up last, slower than the others, still wearing his merchant's coat, Ferris Dobbins. Lena looked at him. She made a decision that took no time at all. "Come in," she said. "Everyone come in." The shelter held 10 adults and 8 children through the night of February 22nd, 1885. This is the accounting of it. Lena Mercer and Eli Mercer, Ruth and Martin Briggs and their 3 children, including Callum, Orrin and Susan Hadley with their 2 daughters, Silas Vance with his wife Clara and their girls Emma and Bess, Mrs. Gertrude Lund, 71 years old, who had told Dobbins to mind his own roof, and who now sat on the sleeping platform in the rear alcove, with both wool blankets over her shoulders, and declared the temperature inside to be the finest thing she had experienced since 1871. Pastor Elias Fogg, Ferris Dobbins. 18 people in a shelter built for 2. The stove ran at full capacity. Lena had never asked it to do this before, and she watched it with the same attention she gave everything, monitoring the pipe collar for any sign of stress, watching the damper, managing the draft to prevent the firebox from running too hot. The clay and ash collar held. The flue drew cleanly. The stone walls did what stone walls do. They absorbed the warmth of 18 bodies in one working stove, and they held it, slowly, steadily, without drama. The floor temperature, she checked it with her hand, the way Thomas had checked his fireplace hearths, was warm to the touch by midnight. The bean and sausage stew served everyone twice. It was not a generous serving. It was a cup per person, the cups being shared among those who had not brought their own. But it was hot and thick, and it was food. And in a stone shelter, on a February hillside, after a flood had taken your floor, it was the most important meal anyone had eaten. Mrs. Lund declared it the finest stew she had encountered since moving west. Orrin Hadley, eating his second cup in the manner of a man who is not embarrassed about being grateful, looked at Lena across the stove. "I moved the corn," he said. "I know," she said. "I moved it on your word. Some people thought—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what people thought," she said. "The corn is above the waterline." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew?" "I thought I knew. There's a difference." She looked at the stove, tending the damper. "I think about systems. Thomas taught me that. When a system is loaded past a certain point, something is going to give." You look at the system, you look at where the load is, and you make your best assessment. "That's engineering," said Vance, from his position against the east wall. "That's masonry," said Lena. But yes, Martin Briggs, who had been quiet since arriving, a large, quiet man who had let his wife's friendship with Lena develop without much involvement from himself, was sitting near the entrance, looking out at the dark valley, where they could all occasionally hear the sound of moving water. He turned to Lena. "How high does the water get?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. This drainage has to go somewhere, and the valley floor is where it goes. The main channel." She thought about what she had read, what she had observed. 4, maybe 6 feet above normal bank level. The lower cabins may have taken water inside. The upper cabins, on the east side of Maine, may have come through. "The mill," said someone, Vance's wife Clara, and there was a quiet intake of breath because the mill sat directly on the creek bank. "I don't know about the mill," Lena said honestly. "I'm sorry." The children, after the initial excitement of the situation, had settled into the particular adaptive pragmatism of children who are often better than adults at accepting the immediate reality as it is, rather than as it should be. Eli and Callum were asleep on the floor by 10 o'clock, sharing the canvas sleeping tarp. The younger Hadley girl had fallen asleep against her mother. The Vance daughters were awake, talking quietly in the corner, with the wide-eyed alertness of children who know they are living through something that will be a story for a long time. He had been almost entirely silent since entering, sitting on the stone floor near the door. He had refused the bench seat Mrs. Lund had vacated, with a brief shake of his head, and looking at the interior of the shelter with an expression that had cycled slowly through several phases over the previous hours. "I said burial hole," he said, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. No one responded immediately. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way a man says something that costs him something real. I was wrong. Ruth Briggs, from her position near the stove, said, "Most of us were, to some degree or another." "Some of us more than others," Dobbins said, with a kind of deliberate accuracy. Lena was tending the stove, and she did not look at him, because she understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person in the middle of an honest reckoning is give them a little privacy for it. "The structure is sound," she said, to the stove, to the room, to all 18 of them. "The drainage is working. The thermal mass has been building heat since September." She adjusted the damper slightly. "We will be warm until morning, and in the morning we will go down together and see what needs doing." The stove ticked and breathed. 18 people breathed with it. Morning came gray and clear, the sky a pale winter blue that showed itself in the square of the entrance, like a painting. The water sounds from below had diminished through the pre-dawn hours, the main pulse having moved through, the creek returning toward its banks, the immediate crisis passing into the long aftermath that floods always leave behind. Lena was the first up. She had slept perhaps 3 hours in the sleeping alcove with Eli warm against her side, and she woke to the quiet of the shelter and lay still for a moment. 18 people in a 14 by 10-foot space, sound in sleep, like a single breathing creature. And the sound was not uncomfortable. It was the sound of shelter doing what it was supposed to do. She built up the fire quietly and made coffee in the large pot, enough for everyone. She stood in the entrance with the first cup in her hands and looked down at the valley. The valley floor was changed. From this height, the damage was visible in the way damage is visible from elevation, as altered geometry, as the wrong shapes in the wrong places. Fence lines lay at odd angles. The road showed a dark scar of deposited silt down its center. 2 of the valley floor cabins, the lowest lying nearest the creek, showed collapsed or partially collapsed walls, the structures unable to sustain the lateral pressure of the water that had moved through them. The mill wheel was not moving, and from this distance she could not determine why. But the majority of the town was standing. She looked at the Upper East Side cabins, the ones she had estimated might escape the worst of the flow, and they were standing, their rooftops clear, their chimneys showing the thin smoke of morning fires being rebuilt after a night of fear. People had survived. She was almost certain of it. The shelter woke gradually. Mrs. Lund first. She was an early riser and had been pretending to sleep, Lena suspected, for the last hour. And then Hadley, and then the children, who came awake with the immediacy of children and immediately wanted to look at the valley. Everyone crowded the entrance for a few minutes, looking at what the night had done. Then, in the way that competent people respond to the morning after a hard night, they began to move toward usefulness. Orr and Hadley, assessing the damage on the valley floor with a builder's eye, began talking to Silas Vance about structural priorities. Which of the collapsed or partially collapsed buildings could be shored and salvaged? Which were likely total losses? What materials were likely available in the immediate term? Vance listened and added, and the conversation had the clean, forward-moving quality of 2 craftsmen who have dispensed with shock and are doing arithmetic. Martin Briggs, who worked the mill, was impatient to get down the slope and assess the wheel and the gearing mechanism. He went down first with Callum, and they were moving at a pace that made Lena think the mill might be repairable. Ruth Briggs stayed with Lena and helped serve out the remaining coffee and the cornbread Lena had made from the camp pan while the shelter slept. She had mixed the batter quietly in the pre-dawn, a small act of pure intention, and when everyone had eaten, they stood for a moment in the entrance, all of them, in the thin morning sun. It was Eli who said it. He had been standing at the edge of the bench outside the entrance, looking down at the valley with his father's measuring gaze, and he turned around and looked at the stone arch of the entrance, the voussoirs, the keystone Lena had tapped home with Thomas's wooden mallet, and then he looked at his mother. Papa would have liked this, he said, and this time his voice was different than it had been on the 9th day of excavation. Then it had been private, gentle, and offering between the 2 of them. Now he said it in front of all these people, and it was not private. It was a statement of lineage, of inheritance, of the chain of knowledge that connected the Pennsylvania stone yards to a hillside in Colorado and to the dry, warm, mortar-scented space that had held 18 people through a February flood. Lena looked at her son. He built the first part of it, she said, in Pennsylvania, in his training, in everything he told me. She looked at the arch. We built the rest. Dobbins had been listening from a few feet back. He came forward now, not with the bluster of October, but with something reduced and genuine. Mrs. Mercer, he said, when this is sorted out, the flood, the repairs, all of it, I have a property on the West Ridge, south-facing slope, good exposure. He paused. I think it should have a proper tenant, someone who understands the site. Another pause, longer. I'd like to offer it to you, at a fair rate, one you'd agree was fair. Lena looked at him for a moment. I appreciate that, Ferris, but I already have a home. He looked at the arch, the entrance, the interior beyond. Yes, he said quietly, you do. They went down the slope together then, all of them, helping each other over the icy sections. The older children taking Mrs. Lund's arms on the steeper pitch. 18 people who had shared a stove and a pot of stew and a night of worry and a morning of clear winter light. Going down to see what needed doing and to do it together. What needed doing was considerable, and it took 3 weeks. 2 of the valley floor cabins were beyond salvage. The structures had lost too much foundation integrity to repair safely. The families in them, the Weston family and old Arlo Crane, who had lived alone since his wife passed, needed somewhere to be, while the question of what came next was worked out. Orrin Hadley put the Westons in his barn loft, which was worn and dry and which the children treated as an adventure. Mrs. Lund, who had more room than she needed in her East Side house, took in Arlo Crane with the decisive hospitality of a woman who had been waiting for an excuse to have company. The mill was repairable. Martin Briggs had been right, and Vance's carpentry and Hadley's metalwork combined to have the wheel turning again within a week, which mattered practically for the whole valley and symbolically for something harder to name. The road was cleared of silt by a collective effort that Hadley organized with the same practical directness he brought to everything. List what needs doing, assign who can do what, start at the worst point, and work outward. It took 4 days. Most of the town participated. She brought her tools, the masonry tools, the pointing trowel, the margin trowel, and she put stone foundations right where they had shifted, and she mortared cracked chimney bases, and she showed Vance a technique for stabilizing a wall that had bowed under water pressure that Thomas had used on a flood-damaged farmhouse in Pennsylvania. Vance watched her hands. "You're a mason," he said, simply. "I'm a mason's wife," she said. "No," he said. He looked at the wall. "You're a mason." She did not argue with him. In the second week of the cleanup, something began that she had not anticipated and did not entirely know what to make of. People started asking questions. Not the politely skeptical questions of October or the cautiously admiring questions of December, but real questions, practical questions, the questions of people who were in the middle of rebuilding and were reconsidering what they were rebuilding toward. Hadley asked about drainage grades for his barn foundation repair. The Weston family, planning a new structure, asked about site selection on the slope above their original lot. Pastor Fogg asked about thermal mass and south-facing windows. Ruth sat with Lena on the stone bench inside the shelter one Thursday afternoon and said, "You know what's happening, don't you?" Lena looked at her. "Tell me." "They're not just asking about your building. They're asking about thinking the way you think, about looking at the whole system." Ruth folded her hands. "Orrin said it to Martin last week. If the Mercer woman had been listened to in November, we could have moved things better, been more ready. He wasn't wrong." "Orrin is rarely wrong," said Lena. "My point," said Ruth, "is that the valley is going to rebuild, and it's going to rebuild differently because of what happened and because of what was here on the ridge when it happened. And the person most responsible for that difference is drinking coffee with me right now." Lena looked at the entrance, the arch, the keystone, the light coming in. She thought of Thomas. She thought of Eli. She thought of what endures. "Then we'd better make sure the coffee is good," she said. Ruth laughed, and the sound of it filled the stone room. On a morning in late April, when the snow on the San Juan foothills was retreating to the high elevations, and the willows along Red Hollow Creek were showing their first green, Eli Mercer climbed to the top of the ridge above the shelter and sat with his back against a warm sandstone outcrop and looked at the valley below. The valley was different than it had been in September. The rebuilding had used some of what Lena had argued. The new Weston structure sat on a south-facing bench 30 feet above the valley floor, with a stone foundation and a drainage grade that a mason had approved. Hadley's barn had a new foundation, properly seated on bedrock. The road was clean and level, and in the places where it ran closest to the creek, had been set back from the bank by 10 feet, at Lena's suggestion, which had caused some discussion at the commissioner's meeting, but which the commissioner, looking at the flood silt line on the old road surface, had approved. Below the ridge, halfway down the slope, the entrance arch of his mother's home caught the morning sun the way it always did, the sandstone warm-toned and solid, the voussoirs fitting each other with their characteristic mutual tension, the keystone at the crown. Eli heard footsteps behind him. His mother sat down beside him. She had Thomas's masonry manual in her hands, her sight log, her inheritance, her record of the winter, and she leaned against him slightly, and they both looked at the valley for a while without speaking. "Next autumn," she said, "I want to build a south window." Below them, the valley breathed. Thank you so much for watching the story all the way to the end. It truly means the world to me. I hope the story kept you company and maybe took you somewhere new for a little while. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving the video a hype and dropping a comment down below, letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I always love reading those. It amazes me every time just how far these stories travel. If this is your first time here, welcome. There are plenty more stories waiting for you on the channel, so feel free to stay and explore. And if you've been here before, thank you for coming back. It means more than you know. Sharing the video with a friend who loves a good story is also a wonderful way to support the channel. I'll see you in the next story.